There's a moment in the Severance Season 2 finale where Mr. Drummond is overseeing the sacrifice of a very cute baby goat. This introduces the captive bolt gun that will eventually bring about his end in one of the funniest moments I've seen on TV lately. But his words, "we commit this animal to Kier," and his eternal war against pain seem even more critical. Since you just came here after watching the episode, you know that we didn't find out what any of the characters pulling the strings in this story are after, not exactly anyway. Due to how it's told, they're withholding that information, and we probably won't get the key answers until they can't do that anymore, which I guess makes sense because as far as I can tell, they are planning at least 2 more seasons. Having covered shows like this in the past, I'm guessing the reaction around Season 2's ending will be split. It is a very good episode of TV, just as the first season's finale was. I think it'd be hard to argue against that. But we've also come to the point where historically, people primarily concerned with solving the show's mysteries will start to react when resolution and answers don't come as fast as they'd like. It's just the way these things work out in my experience. To return to Kier's eternal war against pain, it stands out to me that in this narrative, Lachman is the source of much of the pain they're concerned with. Kier's vision for a world without pain also creates the framework for a fantastic exploitation engine through Severance. And I guess through Ether before that if we look backward. It's hard to say if that was his original intention because much of what we know about the founder comes from Lachman propaganda. This is highlighted pretty directly in the finale when Milchek does his comedy routine with the animatronic Kier, where the personal nature of the barbs indicates that someone, likely Mr. Drummond, is putting words in the founder's mouth. Also, the fact that they cast his likeness 5 inches taller than he was in real life, and that Milchek knows exactly how tall he is for that matter, reveals that the legend is more important at this point in the family's history. This gets back to what I've been saying in my last few videos. As a corporate entity, Lachman is a behemoth and is probably not going anywhere. Most of the questions the show encourages us to ask can be answered through that lens. What does Lachman want? It wants to create value and maximize its market share and profits. Everything we see happen, even the weird stuff, still somehow connects back to that. The additional layer is the motivation and agendas of the key players involved. And in some of those cases, how the power involved in being at the top of this really influential family affects them. How does something like kidnapping Gemma, regardless of how much she was actually a part of that, fit into this strategy? Or what does it tell us about what someone like Jay Megan is trying to accomplish? The mystery surrounding Harmony Cobell's motivations is the best example. When Annie Mark wakes up at the birthing center and she finds out he hasn't finished Cold Harbor, she says Gemma is still alive and that they can save her. Has she discovered the error of her ways? There were times in season 1 that it appeared she might care about these two the way that she says she does here. Or does this just mean she's opposed to what Lachman is doing with the severance procedure she created? Does she want to get back in there and take the project back over and do something different with it? Maybe, actually, probably, but then to what end? She seemed to be inspired by her experience as a child laborer, something she shared with her mother, who ended up addicted to ether and suffered from serious health problems from her time at Lachman. She also seemed to be very dedicated to the founder, who, if we can believe the propaganda, also started out as a child laborer before he went on to found Lachman. She probably arrived at her idea for the severance technology out of love, and her dedication to Kier is probably based on a belief that he was interested in the same thing. This season, we also learned that Jay Megan essentially stole her idea and weaponized her devotion to Kier's philosophy against her so effectively that she's only now trying to take credit for it. Does any of this tell us what she was hoping to accomplish by helping Outie, Mark, and Devin? Not exactly. We know a lot more about who the character is, but the mystery of what she's trying to do is still intact. You could say the same for the rest of the big mysteries. And so if you're looking for an explanation of the ending of this season, that's the starting point. At its center are Mark and Gemma, in a tragic love story that persists beyond his loss at her apparent death and her hopeless isolation as Lachman's prisoner. The idea of being reunited with him kept her going in her darkest moments, while finding out she was still alive put him on a dangerous path of basement brain surgery reintegration to try to save her. The catch here is that he got severed to try to avoid the grief and pain of losing her, which led to the creation of his innie. The sales pitch is that the process is harmless and that his work self would be happy and content. This all comes out in the fantastic opening sequence where they use a camcorder so that his outie and innie can have a conversation. It's the type of situation that can only exist in this story. And because we've been following and have become invested in both of them, it's almost magical. We understand how desperate Mark's situation is and that he's willing to try anything to be reunited with his wife. We also understand that the innies didn't ask to be brought into the situation they find themselves in. On some level, none of us asked to be born into our lives either, but this is different because the innies wake up on the table to a life that only consists of work because it benefits their outies. After he gets over the novelty of seeing his outie self, Innie Mark starts to pick up on this when he realizes they want him to sacrifice his life and the lives of all the other innies to help get Gemma back. From the outie perspective, this is a no-brainer, and in his case, reintegration is a possibility. But as much as we want to see Mark reunited with his wife, we get to an understanding of why his innie wouldn't rush at the opportunity to help. As things heat up, they reinforce some of his concerns by having outie Mark refer to Helly R as Heleny. Up to that point, he seemed sincere in asking for help. Getting her name wrong reminds you of Helena calling Gemma Hannah at the Chinese restaurant, and signals that he might not be above manipulating this part or version of himself to get what he wants. It's hard to fault him, but at the end of the day, he'd sacrifice that part of himself, an actual person who was created for his convenience, if that's the price he has to pay. To his credit, I don't think he was necessarily being condescending or explicitly trying to manipulate him for the sake of it. I think he's being sincere when he says he can't abandon Gemma, but if he helps him get her back, he won't abandon the innie either. It turns out it's not that simple, certainly not as simple as he'd like it to be, and by the time his innie says no when he asked if he can't just trust him, it all makes sense when you ask yourself if this tracks. The innie had been seen as fairly malleable in the first season and eager to please if nothing else. We've been watching a transformation happen ever since Helly arrived though, actively rooting for it most of the time, and we know what losing her would mean for him, and that's not even to mention that he might not survive the process. Still, it's annoying because as much as we like the innie and Helly, we want to see Mark rescue Gemma, even more so after finding out what's happening on the testing floor in episode 7. It gets things off to a great start, and technically this sequence has so much interesting stuff going on. Adam Scott continues to portray these two parts of the same character as unique individuals. There are some slick transitions as the conversation goes back and forth, a really nice super wide flyaway shot that starts tight on Mark and pulls out to show the entire cabin, a shot where they're both superimposed opposite of each other in front of the fireplace, and the inside-outside colors are kind of reversed, since the innie is shot in the warm red from the fire and the outie is in the blue moonlight. It keeps things moving while reinforcing the innie's trepidation and ratcheting up the outie's frustration in what turns out to be a 13-minute back and forth. We learn a little more about how difficult things were for the outie in the wake of the accident, that he lost his teaching job after he started to show up drunk. Colville sets the stage for everything by explaining that Lachman will dispose of Gemma after he finishes the file. So the stakes are clear. They're high because he has to do that, otherwise they won't let him leave MDR until it's done, and because of the switchover between the two floors, it's a fairly elaborate plan that they have to pull off working together. As thrilling as that is for us, the innie doesn't want to let go of Helly, and the outie isn't that well suited to change his mind. Harmony has to speak to him alone when outie Mark loses his patience with trying to reason with a child. This is rich because he's the one who brought him into this world in the first place, and it naturally points out the thing we knew but haven't yet put together in our brains as our frustration continued to grow watching this thing go back and forth. He really is a child, or at best a teenager at this point, and someone experiencing love for the first time. When she takes over, she explicitly explains all that we've been able to piece together about MDR and how the numbers are connected to Gemma. She says they are his wife. The things they feel while looking at the numbers are the building blocks of her mind, her tempers, and every completed file represents a new consciousness for her. He's making her innies, and he has a hard time wrapping his head around the idea that he's completed 24 files. Harmony assures him that Cold Harbor will be the last, and it'll be his final day at Lachman when it's done. They'll have both served their purpose and can be discarded after that. If this hits home for him, he quickly moves on to start wondering why Miss Colville is the one telling him about this and is even there in the first place. It's not from a lack of trying either. Patricia Arquette does this thing where she keeps her eyes locked with his as she backs up and sits down while she's guiding him into the opposite chair. After recognizing that he's hung up on Helly, she tells him that there'll be no honeymoon ending for them. Because she's an Egan, he's nothing to them. This isn't new information, and it is the company line, which we've heard the family state explicitly multiple times. But if she's suggesting that she's somehow different in that regard, it's the first time we've heard her say that out loud. As Mrs. Selvig, with that persona, it seemed like she cared about Mark's future and even supported his decision to quit. And after her true identity was revealed, she did seem disappointed that he returned to work, but it's always seemed like she was putting on an act. But her primary concern was getting the severed floor back and going back to work for Lachman again. Speaking of the Egans, this episode picked up right where episode 9 left off, with Mark waking up in front of Colville and Jane walking in on Helly and MDR. I wasn't 100% sure what he meant when he talked about her tricking him, but it turned out my best guess was right. He was talking about their conversation at the gala. As she stealthily grabs her pen so that she can stab him with it if necessary, he tells her that he doesn't love his daughter, which confirms he knows he's talking to the innie. When he adds that he used to see Keir in Helena, but she lost that as she grew, she says he sounds like a great dad, and he confirms he sired other children in the shadows, which is something that we learned about when Harmony got them into the birthing center. But Keir wasn't in them either. It's all weird because he's there and is an unsettlingly weird character, but it gets weird when he follows up saying that he hadn't seen Keir in any of them until he saw him in her. It's funny because you just sort of assume it's about purity or whatever, because he said it left his other kids when they grew up. But when she pulls back and looks like she's going to stab him and tells him he's going to burn in hell, that's when he says, there he is, as to say he sees him when she's trying to tear things down, like when she took the stage to try to bring his company down at the gala. Even though he's a shuffling old man, he isn't afraid of her. And I'd say this is the most present he's ever appeared in any scene we've seen him in. He tells her that tomorrow will be a special day and then walks out looking pleased. She starts yelling, asking why he came there and what he wants from her, and it appears this was an effective way to mess with her head and keep her conflicted over what to do when Mark comes back. Back at the cabin, Harmony can't change his mind. He goes down the stairs to leave and tells Devin that if she loves her brother, she needs to tell him that the next thing he sees better be the severed floor, or they'll never see Gemma again. Harmony makes her final plea, saying she cares for him. Devin shouts his name, and he crosses the threshold while it cuts to him waking up in the elevator after just arriving at work. Watching this the first time, my reaction was, wait, fuck, for real? No strategizing, no plan, and his response when Colville says Lachman's using him is that he thinks the Save Gemma committee are the ones doing that. The location and switchover, or lack of one in this case since we stick with the innie as he returns to the only place he'd ever known. This is all essential because we have to think of this from his perspective for any of it to make sense. Lachman is using him, as is Colville, Devin, and his Audi. They all are. And that's what he was made for. He's not much different than the adorable baby goat I opened the video talking about. The main difference is that he at least has the illusion of choice. even if it's only choices like the ones video game creators try so hard to present for you, to make it seem like you're in control and that your decisions matter. There really are no choices, but that's something a human brain has a hard time processing. This comes up again when Dylan, who put in his resignation request in the last episode after his Audie's wife cut off their visits, is surprised to find himself back at work on the severed floor. Before he has to run out of the door because he's so busy, Milchek gives him a response to his request, which his Audi has organized in 3 points, with the first being, "Fuck you, how dare you make moves on my wife." He goes on to tell him he gets it. We watch him writing this at home with his kids in the background. He appears to be looking at them differently, even though he clearly loved them before. Gretchen is there, kind of painted in soft light, looking back at him, so when he says she's perfect, we get it too. And given their shared physiology, it tracks that the innie would agree. The surprise here is that hearing that his innie was a self-assured badass is somewhat inspiring. After the sting wore off, he realized that he hoped someday his wife would see in him what she saw in the innie. In the meantime, he decides to give him a choice. If the innie wants to quit, they can, but since he likes knowing he's there, the Audi thinks he should stay. There's a tenderness involved that makes this work better than you might think. When we'd seen him previously, the Audi came off as a loser, so this certainly injects some humanity, but it's more about the way he approaches the hopeless situation. He doesn't try to turn it into something else, he just gives the innie the opportunity to choose. The lack of options creates an obvious parallel with Mark, as neither of them have any good choices, not really. And in a way, Dylan navigating this by himself is almost more sad than what we see happen with Mark. When he left the elevator, he was greeted by a brand new painting, which we'll find out later is titled The Exalted Victory of Cold Harbor. A lot is going on with it, maybe too much to the point that it feels more like it's there for us. As a recap of Season 2, then it's there for them. When I looked closer to see details like the Ortbo Shadow Selves, the Goat Man, and Rickon's friends, it reminded me of the stop-action reenactment of Season 1 in the Luminous listening sequence in the premiere. Helly exits the elevator right behind and they embrace. Typically, you might consider this being a Glasgow block situation with Helena coming down to stack things in the Egan's favor, but the scene with James talking to Helly makes that seem unlikely. They look at the painting together, and someone cuts out the lights. 22 minutes in, this feels like the beginning of a brand new episode starring these two innies. The lights in the hallway start to flash in a way that guides them to MDR, and the score goes into full suspense building mode. When they arrive at their office, they find an animatronic of Keir standing there waiting for them. He's holding a green envelope that Mark opens while Helly looks at this embodiment of Keir's spirit suspiciously. The note is from Milchek and explains that the founder wanted to witness the historic completion of his 25th file. As a bonus, when he opens it up, there's a pop-up waffle to remind us of the waffle party from last season. That's followed by a fast cut to Gemma walking to the closet door of her apartment and shuddering when she sees what she'll be wearing. To help jog our memories, they include a flashback shot of her getting ready to leave on the night of her accident, and we see it's the same outfit and coat. A little later, we'll watch as she shakes her head and says, "What's happening?" out loud. The nurse is there to tell her to get dressed and assure her that everything will be fine. Helly whispers to Mark from their MDR stations, "So what happens when they extract the chip?" He doesn't say anything, but she knows the answer when he looks at her. Still, she shakes her head, wondering aloud how they can believe anything Cobell says. All she's ever done is lie. Mark can't argue against that, but says that Harmony seemed different somehow. There is a non-choice here. He could just not finish the file, see what happens then, but Helly argues that if Cobell is telling the truth, then they're screwed either way, and this is what makes this one of the strongest exchanges in the episode. Since it all ends the same way no matter what they do, she encourages him to finish the file. Maybe if he gets Gemma out, they'll take Lumen down, and then maybe he can do the combining thing, reintegration. It's selfless, but also rational. And when Mark argues that it all might be a lie from his Audi, she counters saying, but if he's not lying, at least you'll have a chance to live. There's a long beat after that before he says, "Yeah, but I want to live with you." And they both start to tear up as the score slowly builds up to the main theme. It's kind of a two-layer reveal. In the first big encounter where we see this amazing face-off between the two marks, something we never imagined that would actually play out, we start to pick up on his childish nature by the end of it. Here you start to realize that it wasn't just that or non-existence that made him reluctant to help. Any Mark spent the whole first season becoming someone with something to say, and part of that was because Helly was there. That journey in the first season gave his existence meaning that went beyond the job he was tasked to do, and led to them having this very real relationship in this unreal circumstance. There's another long beat before Helly lays out the problem. But I'm her, Mark. I'm her. As in, she is Helena Egan. Something that had already come up when she mentioned James' visit and him saying some cryptic shit about the fire of Keir being inside her. She can't completely sever herself from that reality. This causes him to shake his head no, but then he takes a second to consider what she's saying. Shakes his head yes as a tear falls from his eye, and then says okay before he starts refining. The numbers start going up, and we see Dr. Maurer and Mr. Drummond watching from the control room. The next time we see the screen, it shows 99% completion. Helly is watching, and Mark pauses when he's almost done. She lightens the mood by talking about how she'd been trying to think of names of other places besides Delaware. She's come up with Europe, Zimbabwe, and the equator. The last one makes him smile to himself as he sits there and thinks about her. He says the equator, is that a building? She whispers, or a continent. He says maybe it's just a building that got so big, and she cuts in to finish his sentence that it became a continent. Something they say together, and they laugh, and it's also endearing that it feels like the end for them. She says, I just wish we had more time, before he finds the last group of numbers and opens the bin. He stops to look at her and lets her know what's happening, almost asking for permission while also giving her a chance to change her mind. She pulls out the directions to the testing floor and walks over. She puts her head against him, and they look at the screen together, with her saying at least it's a happy one, as in the last batch, which isn't the scary numbers we heard so much about. And then she slides the directions to pass them off to him. They watch him bin the last numbers together. 100% pops up on the screen, and we see Drummond and Maurer's reactions. Drummond grabs his coat and walks out. Maurer opens the drawer and picks up the phone to call Jay Megan. The screen goes black and the lights turn off. Synth music picks up inside the room. A spotlight shines on Keir, and his head starts to move. If the lights turning off in front of the elevator felt like the beginning of a new episode, the green lights and smoke machine you definitely never noticed in the back of MDR before feel like the beginning of that episode's next act. It's all downhill from there, and I've already touched on the joking between Milchek and Keir, which included an actual laughing track, which goes on for a while before he introduces choreography and merriment. This turns out to be a marching band, and I'll be honest in saying I had no idea what was happening when they started making their way to MDR playing their rendition of the Keir hymn, in that I didn't figure out that they were a different department on the severed floor until a few seconds before Milchek addresses them as such much later in the episode. You hear a ding and see James emerge from an elevator that leads straight to a small room with a computer inside. They never explain why his viewing area is its own separate floor, but he has his own space with his special little monitor, and he can wear his special little shirt coat thing with the snazzy buttons on his special day. As he sits down, we see Cecily leading Gemma down the hall to Cold Harbor, and Dr. Maurer announces that they're getting ready to start the efficacy test on the speaker. This seems like a minor detail, but if you found yourself yelling at your screen, it was about breaking down furniture? Are you kidding? What was Cold Harbor supposed to be for? An efficacy test is essentially designed to answer the question, does this product do what it's supposed to do? In this case, does the Severance barrier hold in Gemma's chip when the test subject is confronted with a situation that could trigger a strong reaction based on their outies experiences, something they shouldn't have access to? Milchek thanks the band in MDR and then talks about keeping the love for Mark S going with the Ballad of Ambrose and Gunnell. Gunnell is still a mystery, Egan. The first time we heard of her was in the last episode when we found out that Miss Wong was being shipped off to her empathy center in Svalbard. Ambrose was born in the same year Keir became CEO, which makes it seem likely he was his son. He had the shortest run of any of the CEOs, and according to Irv, he's sometimes unfairly maligned as a black sheep in the annals of the family. Does this song title mean that Gunnell was his wife, or maybe his sister? Who's to say? When Milchek takes the baton and starts dancing, this all started to feel a little over the top for me and a bit fan servicey. I mean, just like in the music dance experience last season, Tramell Tillman exhibits some terrific dance moves, but it sort of felt like they were just trying to devise a way to relive that. I'm guessing people will love it either way. I should also say that when I was going back to take notes and replaying a lot of these scenes, that I was fully infected with the band's music, and his choreographed dance routine with a full marching band does serve the purpose of preventing Mark from leaving. It forces Helly to step up, and after she says goodbye with "see you at the equator," which is so fitting considering neither one of them knows where that is, and it's not a building or a continent, but the dividing line between the hemispheres, the two parts of the whole. After that, she sneaks up and grabs Seth's radio. Milchek has to chase after her to try to get it back, and that gives Mark a chance to make it out into the hall, where he pulls out the directions and takes off following them to the testing floor. Helly had thrown Milchek's radio in the toilet and snuck back out of the bathroom while he went to retrieve it. She's holding the door to keep him inside, which, given their size difference, is not something she'll be able to do forever. When things break down, there's a moment where they both fall to their opposite sides outside the door, and as he gets up to make his way out, Dylan, who we saw making his way back to the office after hearing the band, shows up seemingly out of nowhere to push the trusty snack machine in front of the door blocking the exit. This made me laugh on its own, but I couldn't help thinking about the look on his face when he saw the animated version of himself going crazy over the new snacks and the luminous listening thing. There's another elevator ding, and this time Drummond comes up from the testing floor into the black hallway. He walks out, looks both ways to make sure no one's around, and then pushes on the wall to reveal a secret doorway. We see Mark sprinting towards the testing floor as he disappears into the wall, while Gemma is moving slowly towards Cold Harbor. When she stops at the door, we see Lorne wearing heavy makeup and period garb, pushing a cart with a baby goat in it, as she brings one of the mammalian nurturable's finest baby goats, and we learn what they're actually raising them for. She waits outside the secret door, and Drummond eventually opens it. She says she has an offering, and he asks, has it verve? She says yes, and when he asks if it has wiles, she says the most of its flock. He tells her this beast will be entombed with a cherished woman whose spirit it must guide to Keir's door. Is it up to the task? And she confirms that it is. He then pulls an old-looking captive bolt gun from a glass cabinet on the wall, loads it, walks over, and tells Lorne to give him its life. At the same time, the nurse opens the door to Cold Harbor and Gemma walks in. Maurer is in the control room and tells her through a microphone to enter the room. She looks confused, but she walks around the corner and sees the crib, and I guess now we know why it said Cold Harbor on the box. He asks her who she is. She stares blankly and says she doesn't know, which makes James Egan smile as he watches. In case you don't remember, Mark is the one who did this in episode 7. And if you watched my video about the episode, I brought up how it seemed like the pivotal scene, given that this was the turning point of their relationship, or the darkest moment that set things up for her departure. I'll Be Seeing You by Billie Holiday is playing during that scene. And in that same episode, we heard it again in her apartment on the testing floor, and now it's playing in the background here. Gemma walks up and sees a screwdriver in the crib, which Maurer tells her to use to take it apart. As she picks it up, it cuts to Milchek kicking the bathroom door, trying to get out as the band continues to play, and it was this transition where the chaos the band injects really made sense. The contrast between Cold Harbor and MDR adds so much intensity, and it's just funny to watch the severed band members continue to go for it like they can't imagine doing anything different. Milchek can't escape, and neither can poor little Emil, who they've loaded into a white box that looks ceremonial. I'm not even sure what you would call it. The markings on the side show up again in the animations that play during the closing credits. It's disturbing, and the wranglers who are in charge of these goats got some amazing acting out of this kid. And this is where Drummond says we commit this animal to Keir and his eternal war against pain. Mark gets to the hallway on the testing floor but can't open it with his blue key card. This puts him directly across the hall from the sacrifice, where before Lauren pulls the trigger, she asks how many more she has to give. After confirming she's talking about the goats, Drummond says as many as the founder calls. You can't help but wonder here, because obviously her whole life revolves around raising these animals, but she doesn't ask this question in a way that sounds like even one is too many. This is something she's done before. How many times has she been forced to repeat this ritual? How many people has the founder called for? What would her outie say if she knew that part of the time she spends down there is spent doing this? As far as the innie's concerned, it is her job, so she gets ready to do it anyway. But they hear Mark pounding on the door in the hallway, which means Drummond has to step away. He comes out to find Mark hanging on the door frame trying to get in, and this is another hilarious moment because it highlights how much more imposing Drummond is. You don't have long to consider it, because after a brief attempt to talk his way out of it, the larger man absolutely thrashes Mark, who fights back as best he can, but he's so outmatched in every way. After a bit of back and forth where Drummond appears to be okay with killing him, he gets him on the ground and starts choking the life out of him before Lorne comes into the frame and puts her gun to his head while saying no more killing. Drummond has no choice but to let go, and Mark gasps for air. Drummond looks like he's gonna give up, but knocks the gun out of Lorne's hand. He starts thrashing her, but Brienne of Tarth turns out to be a much tougher opponent. She gets the upper hand with Mark's help and grabs the gun, intent on executing him. But Mark begs her to wait. She does, and as she starts to weep, we hear "I'll be seeing you," and it cuts back to Gemma breaking down the crib. James looks elated by this, and Maurer says the barrier is holding. She feels nothing. It's beautiful. These guys have been bringing the creepiness all season, but it's really front and center in these scenes. As she's finishing up, we see the testing floor hallway door open, and Mark has the gun to Drummond's head. He thanks Lorne, and she thanks him for the goat she's now holding in her arms. The two men get into the elevator, and he starts to tell him that in a second he's going to turn into his outie, but we hear the ding as he starts to change over, and in the process the gun goes off. So when his outie wakes up, he's holding this thing getting covered with blood and has absolutely no idea what's going on. Drummond falls on the floor to die while his feet block the elevator door from closing. Mark makes his way down the hall looking for Cold Harbor. Helly and Dylan hold the line. At one point, she starts grabbing instruments and hitting Seth with them. And it's the moment when one of the band members start to get pissed, saying the instruments are the property of choreography and merriment, that I realize that it's another department. And you kind of pick up that they were maybe printed by O&D. C&M gets ready to fall back. The leader says their performance has been compromised, but Helly jumps up on the cubicle to try to stop them. She says their friend Irving is gone, and Lumen wants their whole department gone. If Milchek gets out of that room, they'll all be dead. They're gonna turn us off like fucking machines. Because they've lost friends too, they could be next. She says they give them half a life and think they won't fight for it. When Mark makes it to Cold Harbor, the nurse Cecily tries to jump in front of him. Sandra Bernhardt gets a great line delivery here when she says, "Step off, fucko." And comically, Mark tries to shoot her with the bolt gun that doesn't have a charge in it anymore. And their whole encounter here is pretty good. She runs away without opening the door for him. He tries to unlock it unsuccessfully with his hand, which doesn't work since it doesn't recognize his blood. And then he realizes he's covered with Drummond's, so he sticks his tie between his finger and the sticker, and that works. The door opens, and we notice that he doesn't get the Zolly treatment when he crosses the threshold. He just stays outie Mark. He sees this new innie of Gemma. who doesn't know him and is terrified by this man who's walking towards her covered in blood. Maurer sees what's happening and tells her not to talk to him. He says that this is a real threat. And behind their screens, Maurer and James look more fascinated than worried at first. From here to the end, it's a crazy setup because this innie should definitely fear this person. And it would mean something if the love her outie had for him bled through. This would undermine the whole test. The way they arrange this is even crazier than that and tickles the sci-fi part of my brain in all the right ways. This is just the beginning. Here we have a brand new innie with outie Mark. And if you think about all the switchover points and how they'll affect this couple as they cross through them, the writers covered all their bases. Mark tries to tell Gemma about their life together. Despite any good sense she might have, she looks somewhat drawn to him. Maurer starts to get worried and tells her this isn't part of the test. Mark says please and reaches out his hand while the doctor tells her not to let him touch her. When he says they have to leave, she grabs a hold of it and allows him to walk her to the door. Maurer and James both start freaking out. The nurse starts freaking out. The doctor tries to call Drummond, who definitely won't be answering. James says, oh fuck. Then when they're about to walk out, he just screams fuck. And watching him do that is so satisfying. Maurer leaves his office, running out into the hall. And outside of Cold Harbor, we see the innie Gemma turn into the real one. Her and Mark have a pretty long beat to embrace, and it was totally worth the wait. It's what everything has been leading up to. And both actors draw on what they built up in episode 7 to make this feel real. But they still have a long way to go until it can actually become that. Then an alarm starts going off and everything turns red. On the severed floor, Helly hears this and is scared at first, but then she realizes it means they're probably escaping and gets a bittersweet smile on her face. Milchek looks gutted and turns to look at himself in the mirror. At first you think this might be his turning point. There were so many indications that he may flip sides by the end of this season, and just take a moment to rewind his day. He even got dunked on by Wax Kier. But then you remember the Grow scene where we last saw him looking in a mirror after his performance review. And you realize this guy will go down with the ship if necessary. Gemma leads them towards the elevator. Maurer runs down the hall screaming for her, which is a pretty memorable look for Robbie Benson. They make it to the elevator and Maurer screams at the door as it's closing, "You'll kill them all." It took me a minute to figure out what he meant because they were about to kill her after she completed the test. On the surface, in both scenarios, they all die. Then I realized we saw that he was in love with her innies, the ones he spent so much time with. And in the cult's logic, entombing her with the sacrificed goat would really deliver her to Kier, which I suppose would keep the door open for him to be reunited with her when he reached the end of his life. If she goes outside and never comes back, those innies really would be dead in a sense because they would never be reactivated and they wouldn't be waiting for him in the afterlife. Outie Mark hears this, but the elevator starts to go up and they both change over in the process. It makes for an awkward moment when Miss Casey comes out to see that she's kissing Mark S and that he's covered in blood. She asks what's taking place in a way that only Miss Casey could, and if you're keeping track, this is the third combination of people that inhabit these two bodies. The door opens and they start running for the exit. Milchek is now powered up after his mirror work and has moved on to getting a running start before charging into the vending machine. Then he turns around methodically before repeating the process again. With the red lights and alarms, it's chaotic. Miss Casey has no idea what's going on, but she keeps up. Milchek keeps charging. Dylan eventually falls, allowing Seth to make his way out on his next attempt. At the same time, Mark and Miss Casey round the corner and see the exit. Mark tells her she has to go outside. Milchek comes out to see Dylan waiting, and with C&M having his back, he says, "Fuck you, Mr. Milchek." Gemma gets outside and seems to wake up just fine. No kill switch, she's just herself and she finally made it out. She starts screaming for Mark, saying that they have to go. It's brutal to think about everything she went through to get to that place, and she still finds herself out there alone. This is now the final combination of innie Mark and outie Gemma, and he's torn over the decision. He has to choose between his own life and what he thinks he owes his outie. He's frozen in place and can't push the bar to leave, and over over his shoulder, we see Helly come around the corner and call his name. It's a real everything for the Audis moment, just like Helly said to Dylan in the last episode. Mark looks at her and sees her sadness and knows that if he asked her what to do, she would tell him to go without having to hear her say it. She'd make the sacrifice in a heartbeat, and still we see him turn and walk down the hall while Gemma screams for him, saying they need to leave. As a viewer, this tied me up in a complete knot to where I wasn't even sure what I wanted to happen. There were so many things going through my head about what might happen when they got there, some of which were very sad, but all were somehow not as brutal as the choice he has to make here. In hindsight, it's easy to see how everything led to this exact moment and how it's really just more of the same. He doesn't have a choice here. When he looks through the window, he sees someone he doesn't know. Maybe he experiences some of that bleed through that Ernie experienced in the Cold Harbor room, but that can't really hold a candle to what's waiting for him at the end of the hall. Even knowing it's completely nonsensical, they're innies. They have no future. When he grabs her hand, they gaze into each other's eyes, and they bolt down the hall, leaving Gemma behind, alone, desperately banging on the door, waiting for her husband to come back and have her pain mean something. Even with nowhere to go and not knowing if this will last for more than a minute, he still doesn't have a choice. He has to do it. You have no idea where they might go or what they plan to do when they get there. The windmills in your mind plays as they run, and the lights do their alarm thing. It does a freeze frame of them and starts to zoom in, and then it fades to red as the credits roll. The first time I watched this, I didn't know how I felt about it. I didn't dislike it, and I didn't throw a candy tin, but I was conflicted and just sort of left wondering where they go from here. All the characters you're rooting for can't get what they want. To be clear, I was on the edge of my seat throughout the episode, even with the parts that didn't work as well, which I've pointed out. I loved Innie and Outie Mark talking to himself, and I wasn't expecting that to take on the I brought you into this world and I can take you out energy. We got explanations for the MDR numbers, the goats, and what would happen when Cold Harbor was finished. I thought the conclusion to the Dylan thruple story worked well. Got charged up seeing Helly shouting they give us half a life and think we won't fight for it, and laughed so many times with Milchek running away after putting Dylan's letter on the table and Mark shooting Drummond probably topping the list. Plus, Brianna Tarth. There was a lot of talk about the blood and gore rating before this episode aired, and I thought the fight on the severed floor had that covered before the elevator went down and we realized we hadn't seen any blood yet. Still, it's just a tough situation where you find yourself wanting too many things to be true, and they can't all work out. What a mess Lumen has made with Severance. All for Kier's eternal war against pain. I have no idea what happens next. That really isn't a bad thing, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. We'll be doing the final live discussion Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, so join us for that and bring questions. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.
Lumen Goon.